Father, be with us now as we talk about one more aspect of transition that we wanted to cover. Help us to see, Lord, what you would say to us from this text. I pray this in your name. Amen. We've been looking at transition. What's the purpose of it? Why do we go through it? What are we supposed to be doing? What is God preparing us for? And my encouragement to us is that we need to adjust our mindset. See, most of the time we think about life as moving from one sitz im Leben, situation in life. We think about moving from one situation in life where it's relatively comfortable and normal to another situation in life. That's the journey. We know life is going to change, but we want to get as quickly to the new normal as possible, stay there in that comfort zone of that new sitz im Leben. And what my encouragement was actually to think about life differently. Instead of moving from one sitz im Leben to the next, maybe we needed to think about life as moving from one transition to the next, where these situations, those normative spaces, are actually just pit stops along our journey. The reason I encourage that for us is because the place of transition is the place of dependency on God. That's the place where we enter into the unknown. We know what we've come from. We may begin to experience and understand what we're going through, but we don't know where we're going. And so we want to be in a place where we can put our trust in the sovereign God whose presence is already where we're going. But for many of us, that's a difficult shift to make in our minds because we have a bent towards the familiar. Last week we talked about Israel's 40th year in the wilderness. And one of the things I didn't mention, but that is really central to the text, and I don't think we reflect on often enough, is that, of course, if you recall, Israel, the Hebrew people, are enslaved in Egypt, major oppression. It's not a good scene. They've been there for 400 years. Finally, God rescues them from slavery. So their sitz im Leben, if you will, was living in oppressive slavery. That was their sitz im Leben. God comes in. He says, hey, I'm going to save you from that. We're going to move to this new place, this promised land I'm going to give you, but in the meantime, you're going to have to go through transition. That transition was so difficult that they made it about 2 days before they said, you know what? We'd rather go back to what we know. We'd rather go back to slavery. We'd rather go back to the oppression that we know because this transition is so difficult. That's how difficult transition can be. No sooner had they arrived or entered it than they said, we'd rather be back in slavery. Transition for them in that moment felt more uncomfortable than the life that they left behind. And I don't think we spent enough time thinking about how part of our bent towards the familiar is that transition can be challenging. It can be difficult. We'd rather live in the places that we used to be. And so our transitions and what our sitz im Leben may not be as dramatic as moving from slavery to the promised land, but I think we have the same mindset. The transition can sometimes be so difficult that we'd rather just remain where we are. Or once we're in transition, we look back on life as it was and say, I wish I could have stayed there. And we forget about our previous challenges and think that life was really good. But a lot of times in those situations, how much did we have to depend on God? And so I think we should look for transitions. We should desire the place of dependency. But here's what I want to reflect on today. How do we know that the transition we are seeking is actually the one that God desires of us? When I say that we should seek transitions, the place of dependency, I'm not suggesting that we should live our lives in chaos or attempt to live in constant change or live our lives in a way that invites disorder. What I'm trying to get us to consider is that our tendency is to remain in places of comfort. But if we do want to be in that place of dependency on God and we want to move out of our comfort, how do we know whether the movement is the right one or the wrong one? And that's what we're going to look at a little bit today from our text. But I want to give you a story, a little bit of context for what brought this to mind. Because back in May, I was sitting with my doctoral cohort. We have a 1-week intensive every year where we get together, lock ourselves in a conference room, or in this case, lock ourselves in a conference center. And you can really get to know each other pretty well when you're locked in a conference center with nowhere to go, with no transportation for a week. And one of the advantages of doing more advanced educational study is that the further you get down the road, typically, the more closely your cohorts and your colleagues align with your age. Like you start to tend to become kind of from the same life situation, same age, whatever. So all of us are about 10 years from one end to the other. We're all in about a 10-year range, including our advisor who's within 10 years of the majority of us. So part of the benefit of pursuing this education is getting to hear other people's stories from people who don't live in your context. And so maybe they have a different view or a more objective view of what you're going through. And we can share our challenges. some of our encouragements. And those relationships, again, tend to blossom really quickly when you're together for a week locked in a conference room. So one of my colleagues named Bill, he's a pastor in Kansas City, and he asked the group a question that he was wrestling with. And Bill is this incredibly thoughtful guy. Like, he's thoughtful, he's creative, he's gifted in ministry, he like all the things that, you just go, man, this guy he's just awesome. And so within his denomination, he's getting a lot of pressure, or he was getting a lot of pressure to move out of his current context and to take a different role elsewhere. And so, but he loves the church he's at, and his family is thriving, and his wife loves the church. And so all these things are happening. And so he says, how do I know? What am I supposed to do? And so what Bill was expressing was a sentiment that I think a lot of people struggle with. And we could call these things the twin pillars of transition. That's the way that I think about them. On the one hand, Bill didn't want to just remain complacent, right? He didn't want to just remain comfortable in the situation that he was in just because of his current Sitzim Leben that he enjoyed, that was comfortable. He didn't want to stay there. That's what we've been talking about, right? That's a positive desire. But the flip side, the other pillar of transition, is that we do live in a society that tends to encourage transition at all costs. It tends to encourage upward mobility, right? Career transition, or in a way that's tempting, but it's not always healthy. So our society is so transient. I've been reading articles even over the last week about how, because of the rise of remote work, there's areas of the country that are giving you incentives to move there. $5,000 down payment on a house. One place I read was giving you a $5,000 bonus to go just to move there. Then they were giving you a free golf membership for as long as you live there. And they were giving, yeah, exactly. I was like, see you guys. I'll see you there. It's like in Minnesota, Andrew, if you want to go. And then it was and then you got access to a community center or some sort of a gym or whatever. And so there's this idea that we can just be transient. We just can move whenever we want to. For many generations, moving up the corporate ladder was a hallmark, primarily for the baby boomers. But the motivation, ironically, was typically greater comfort, better office, more money, bigger house, that sort of thing. But it often came at the expense of deep-rootedness. It came at the expense of community. It came at the expense of family. That same generation that, and this is not a knock on anybody who's a baby boomer, but that same generation that encouraged upward mobility, seeking out comfort at all costs, moving up, getting more money, is also the generation that introduced the highest level of divorce in the nation's history. So it came at the expense of all these other things. It's not necessarily healthy. So that's what Bill was wrestling with. He didn't want to be complacent, and he didn't want to be passive, but how do you know it's the right time? How do you know what's the right transition to make? Because not all transition is healthy. And so ultimately, the passage we're looking at today is what Jeff, our advisor, pointed us to. He said something to the effect of, you have to look for the Macedonian man. Now, maybe you're familiar with the passage we're going to read today, and that makes sense to you. But for a lot of us, maybe we're going, what in the world does that mean? Well, here, let me jump into this story to give context. Paul is a first century missionary. He's on a journey preaching the gospel to various cities in what we know of as modern-day Turkey. He goes to a city, he stays there a while, then moves on to the next city. But suddenly there's this transition moment that is introduced where Paul is wrestling with where he's going to go next. So let me read this text to us. And they, now at this point, this is Paul and Silas and Timothy, went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And when they had come to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing there, urging him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go on to Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. I preached on Acts 16, verses 6 to 10 on August 21, 2016, as you will all recall. I went back to find it. I knew that I had preached on the book of Acts, went all the way through it, and I was like, how long ago was that? Well, it was 9 years ago. It was 2 days before Judah was born. So what feels like just yesterday was over 9 years ago, and I had half a mind to just preach that sermon because I read it. I was like, that's pretty good. That'll save me some time. I'll just do that one. No one's going to remember. I'm not doing that, by the way. But in that sermon, what I focused on was closed doors. And what I want to focus on today is a little bit different angle, which is this idea of transition. How do we know what path God is leading us down? And of course, closed doors are a part of that. Sometimes the only way to know where God is leading is to know where he isn't leading. One of the things I find frustrating about this passage is that we don't actually have any idea how Paul knew that some paths were closed off to him. We just read that they were. The text says he wanted to go to Asia, but he was forbidden. Then he wanted to go to this other region, Bithynia, but the Spirit didn't let him. Well, I want to know, how did he know that? What does it mean that the Holy Spirit forbid him to go? What does it mean that Jesus, the Spirit of Jesus, blocks him from going? Did Jesus pop up one night and say, I forbid you to go? And that would make our lives a lot easier. My friend Bill would have loved it if Jesus popped up around the dinner table one night and said, ignore that man's request, the guy asking you to look for a different career path. And what's more, we have no idea why Paul was forbidden. We don't know why he was told not to go. I don't know why it was that Paul could not go and preach the gospel in Asia. Seems like a perfectly logical thing for him to do. It would make it a lot easier for me to wrap my head around the idea of a closed door if I knew the reason that a door was closed. As the great American theologian Garth Brooks reflects on in Unanswered Prayers, the reason that he says, I thank God for unanswered prayers, is because years later he runs into his high school sweetheart and he remembers, I used to pray that I would marry this person, and now years or decades later I look back and go, I didn't know anything that I was praying for. Thank God he didn't answer that prayer. And sometimes where we think we want to walk through a door, the door ends up closed, and then years later we discover why that door was closed to us. But most of the time that's not what happens. Most of the time there's a closed door and we aren't given any reason why. And in this case, there's nothing in the text to indicate that Paul was given that information either. No information that tells us that he got clarity on it later in life. The door was closed. That's all we're told. But what we can deduce from this passage is that Paul was not being passive. Paul was still strategizing. Paul and his companions thought that it was a good idea to go to Asia, and they thought that it was a good idea to go to Bithynia. So Paul is not passive in seeking out the next steps that God has for him. He's not going to move forward without God's permission, but he is going to strategize. He is going to come up with a plan. There was some reason he thought those movements would be a good idea. In his mind, those plans made perfect sense. And not only did they make sense, but it also appears that it never even occurred to him that he should go to Macedonia. But the second thing we can deduce is it reminds us that in our periods of transition, we usually don't know what we think we know. And that's the place of dependency. That's the place of depending on God's sovereignty. Because there's another question that sort of lingers in the text. What would have happened if Paul went to Asia anyway? What would have happened if Paul went to Bithynia? And I don't want us to go down that rabbit hole and start trying to identify and figure out hypotheticals, but I think we do need to consider that sometimes our unfettered pursuit of transition or the what's next can lead us to places that God might not be telling us to go. That might not be God's desire for us, which we'll come back to in a second. So Paul is forbidden to go to these places. We have no idea how he knew that or why he was forbidden. But we can deduce that he wasn't being passive. He had plans. God just said no. The second thing that we do find, as Paul's leading on utter dependency on God, is we discover that God's leading is there. What was it that led Paul to Macedonia? Paul has a vision of a man from the region of Macedonia who tells him, come and help us, which seems like the ideal way for God to speak to you. We think to ourselves in a cursory reading of this passage, why can't God send a man in my dreams just to tell me what I'm supposed to do? It's not actually that easy, and it wasn't that easy for Paul, which we'll see in a second. We think it would be. It's not. But there are still moments, it's maybe rarely a person popping up and speaking to us, but I think what we discover from this is that God does speak. And God does lead you if you have ears to hear. And this is what my advisor was getting at when he said, look for the Macedonian man. It might not actually be a Macedonian man, or a man telling you where you should go, or a woman telling you where you should go. But the reality is that God does give direction and signs if we're willing to listen. And in my own life, I've been fortunate enough to have a lot of those moments. And the longer you live, and the more you reflect on this, the more you should find the same. That there were moments in your life where you were uncertain or unclear about where you should go, and you look back and you realize God was speaking to me in that moment. One time Christy and I were, this was in like 2008, and we were looking to go attend a church planters boot camp. We had no money. We decided not to go. And then randomly, we got a tax refund or a rebate or something that we weren't expecting in the mail for the exact amount of money that we needed to go to the thing. And I actually thought to myself at the time, I go, well, that's probably just coincidence, you know? And then I talked to somebody about it, and he was like, you're being an idiot. That's the Lord telling you should go. So we did. I've told this story about how we ended up at Restore. You know, when we were, it was 2010, early 2010, well, late 2009, actually. And I was in the early stages of planting a church in Schenectady. It was pretty clear that all the other doors were closed. But then one day, I get a phone call asking if I could come down to preach on a Sunday to New Jersey. And I talked to Christy about it. We agreed that we could make it work, but she was very, very clear that if I had any intention of moving to New Jersey, she was going to disabuse me of that notion right now. That was not happening. We were not moving to New Jersey. There was no chance on God's green earth that we would ever move to New Jersey. She was very clear. And then we got here, and we got back in our van to drive back to Schenectady after preaching there, and it was Christy who was like, crap. Like, I think this is where we're supposed to go. And she was receiving the prompting of the Holy Spirit. And then, we conferred with others, and we discovered that was right. And there have been times over the last 15 years where we've wondered, is now the time for a transition? We've asked ourselves, is now the right time? Is God prompting us? And every time there was something, sometimes subtle, sometimes obvious, some moment of God speaking where it became clear that he was like, stay the course, or don't make major change, make this minor change, or whatever it might be. There were these moments, if you're willing to listen, where God is leading you. He speaks in a variety of ways, and it's not typically through the vision of a person telling you what you should do. And I think that's the point, and that was Jeff's point when he asked, where's the Macedonian man? Are you listening for God's leading? Because there are closed doors, but then there's also the absence of God telling you to go. And in the absence of God speaking to you clearly, it seems like it's a pretty good reason not to make that transition yet. You need to be listening for God's voice and whatever that is. God doesn't, it does, again, we might not have a vision like Paul's, but it doesn't mean God won't speak. And God doesn't leave us to wonder or guess. He communicates with us if we are listening. The danger for us is that we can feel so strongly about our own plan or our own strategy that we fail to listen. We fail to be patient waiting for God's voice to come. Like, we don't really know how long what was described to us in this passage, we don't know how many weeks, days, months it took. I will tell you that this portion of what they're talking about here is they've traveled about 400 miles on foot. So we're not talking about, just like, this all happened in like a matter of a couple of days. This happened over a period of time where Paul was listening. Paul and his companions are legitimately having to listen, going, let's strategize, let's plan, let's try this, let's try that. But they just didn't know until God finally spoke. And sometimes it takes time. You don't know. And so, again, you have these twin pillars when you're going through, maybe when you're in a current Sitzum Leben, you're in a situation, you go, I know that I don't want to stay in a place of comfort. I want to make sure I'm looking for God's leading, maybe moving into transition, maybe depending on God. But I also don't want to move too quickly just because I think I should. And that's the period of patience where you have to wait, the way that Paul did in this moment, listening for God's leading. But God's, we may prefer it in our heads that God would just send us a vision, man. Like, send me a guy or a gal to just pop into my dream one night and tell me what's going on. Because then we think we'd be able to figure it out on our own. And that's where I think we look at this story and we think, well, that was so much easier because then Paul could just immediately make the decision. He like as if he woke up and was like, well, now I know what to do. I'm good. That's not actually what happens, but it's so subtle that we miss the third resource. So God gives us closed doors. He gives us his leading. There's a third resource he gives us, and that's community input. And Paul does not make the decision of what he's supposed to do on his own, despite the fact that if we read this quickly, we might think he did. We might think that Paul got the vision, popped up, and was like, here we go, guys. Like, Paul, Silas, Timothy, we're going to roll out now because I had this vision last night. That's not actually what happens the way that the text reads. This is what the text says in Acts 16, verse 10. And when Paul had seen the vision, Paul sees the vision, immediately we sought to go on to Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. This is a very fast transition. It's just one sentence. I think we get caught up on the word immediately. And I do think that what the author of this text is trying to communicate is that they didn't sit on the decision. Once they had clarity, they knew, they made the decision, they went, and they didn't look back. Once they had clarity. As soon as maybe they had clarity immediately. Maybe it took a day or two to have clarity, but when they had clarity, They immediately moved on. They had clarity that and as soon as they did, they knew what they needed to do. But the important piece is that Paul and his companions came to this decision together. It was only Paul who had the vision, but the text does not say that immediately Paul sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called him to preach. Paul did not unilaterally decide that he was going to go to Macedonia, that he had this word from God and that he could figure out what it meant on his own. The inference that's happening in this text, and it's more than just an inference, as I'm going to show you in a second, is that when Paul woke up, maybe he had the vision in the dream, maybe he had the vision at night, okay? But as soon as he wakes up, or as soon as he has a vision, he goes to his friends, he goes to his companions, and he shares with them what had happened, and then together they concluded, they discerned what God was saying. Together they sought to go to Macedonia. We went to Macedonia, not Paul concluded, that we concluded that God had called us, not just Paul, us, to preach the gospel to them. They together discerned what God was saying. And there's another subtle thing in the text that brings that out even more, because the language here changes for the first time in the book of Acts from them, where the author is saying, and they discerned that they should go, to the author saying all of a sudden, and we sought to go, concluding that God had called us. In other words, there's another character introduced into the story that previously was writing from an outsider's perspective and now is writing from an insider's perspective, and that's the author of this book, Luke. That for the first time in the book of Acts, we see Luke pop onto the scene, and all of a sudden he's incorporated into all the scenes that happen after this, that he speaks as a we. Now, was that the reason that God didn't allow Paul to go to Asia or didn't go to Bithynia? Was it because Luke was waiting in Troas? What would have happened if Paul decided to go to Asia anyway? Like I said, regardless of whether or not he felt like that was a closed door. Because, again, just like anything else in life, there are some things that you can't force your way through if you feel like there's a closed door. And there are other times where you can still force it through. It's a closed door, but it's like a screen door. You run hard enough, you might get through it. Okay? So there are times you can push through. We're not told what prevented Paul and his companions from going. It may have just been an instinct. It may have been intuition. Maybe there was a legitimate reason that they couldn't go. But presumably, Paul could have still gone to Asia, or he could have still gone to some other city if he wanted to. And we don't have time to do a deep dive on how much we can thwart the plans of a sovereign God. But we can make them more difficult. We can make it more difficult to walk down the journey that God has called us to. We may not be able to thwart his plans. Like maybe there's some alternative reality where Paul goes to Asia and God still gets him back to Troas so that he meets Luke to pick up Luke on the journey. We have no idea. But I can say, I can't say for certain that the reason that Paul couldn't go to Asia was because God wanted Paul to meet Luke here in Troas. I have no idea. We don't get answers to questions like that. We don't get answers like, well, what would have happened? We don't get answers to the hypotheticals. But what I can say for certain is that as a result of Paul getting to Troas, he met Luke. Luke, the Holy Spirit-inspired author who would write the Gospel of Luke and would write the book of Acts. One volume, or one book, 2 volumes. That he would write basically the history of the early church that we have. Because Paul went to Troas, he met Luke. That we know for certainty. When Paul gets this vision, he doesn't just decide, oh, this is obviously what God wants. He doesn't get the vision and go like, oh, I got it, I got clarity now, and then just decide, this is what God intends for me, and I'm just going to go unilaterally make this choice, and I'm going to go and do this. He brings it up with his trusted companions so they can make an informed decision together. And this happens all throughout the book of Acts, where the affirmation of the community is so important to the decisions that are made even by individuals. It starts with Paul in his first missionary journey. When he gets sent out, he's affirmed by the church in Antioch. You have to think about, if anybody knew what they were supposed to be doing, it was Paul. Paul's walking down the road as an enemy of Christ. All of a sudden, Jesus meets him on the Damascus road, takes his eyesight, pops up, and is like, hey, by the way, Paul, you're going to be a missionary. This is what you're going to do now. You would think that if any of us had a very clear call, that would be it. Paul still goes and gets affirmed by the church in Antioch. It's the church in Antioch who prays and discerns that they should send Paul out. It happens with Apollos, one of the best preachers that we see in the New Testament. His vision, his message is clarified by community members. Later in Paul's journey, he plans to go to Jerusalem, and there are leaders in one of the churches who are like, we don't think you should go. And they were right about what would happen. Paul still chose to go, but he took and we shouldn't read that as him operating unilaterally, but him listening to the voices of the community, but still being responsible for his own choices. God has given us brothers and sisters around us to help us discern the path that God has for us. That is the reason, one of the reasons the community around you exists. Because you don't have all the information. And again, I could tell you so many stories of this where I shudder to think what would have happened in my own experience if I had neglected or ignored the voices of the people around me. So many opportunities in my life to be like, I don't think that person speaking in my life really had all the information. I'm going to do what I feel anyway. There was one moment in my life, again, I'm sure I've told this story before, and I just left a particular ministry that I was leading. And I was really like, this was the question I was wrestling with. I've told you this, I'm sure, over 15 years. Some of you have heard it, some of you haven't. But I really felt like I was evaluating whether I should stay in ministry. And here was essentially the question, the way I was phrasing it in my head was this. Just because I feel comfortable speaking in public, which not everybody does, but I felt comfortable speaking in public, just because I feel comfortable speaking in public, does that mean that I'm obligated to preach the gospel? That was the way the question was phrased in my head, for whatever reason. Could I have done something else? Like, could I just go into some other career path? Could I go into public relations or marketing? Could I go into some other thing? And so one day, after I had spoken at my father's memorial service, this was in 2008, and a trusted friend and mentor came up to me afterwards, hadn't talked to this guy in years, and he walks up to me, and he looks at me in the eyes, and he goes, I just want you to know you're obligated to preach the gospel. And I was like, there's no way that this guy could have known that that's what was going on in my head. He had no reason to know that that was the question and the way I had phrased it in my head. And we can debate whether that's a reasonable way to phrase the question. We could have a long conversation about that, but that's how I phrased it in that era of my life. And this guy had no reason to know that. And he comes up, and I go, well, that'll really help you discern some things, right? And I was like, how did he know that? I was going to say earlier that I've never had a vision of a man speaking to me in a dream, but that's not actually true. There was a time, and it wasn't that long ago in my life, where I was wrestling with a personal question. I had a vision of someone I respected, and in my dream or vision or whatever you want to call it, I asked them this particular question I was wrestling with, and this person in my dream gave me an answer, and I felt like it was so real and clarifying that it was one of those things that you woke up and you're like, I'm pretty sure that was legitimate. But I didn't believe it myself because I don't have the power to discern that. So I brought it up to Christy, and she was like, I think you really need to listen to that. Like, I think that was a discerning thing that happened, and she affirmed that. It's very rare for us to be able to hear God's voice and know with certainty that his leading, that we've accurately determined what God has said. You do not have the capacity on your own to simply figure out what God is saying to you without the affirmation of the community around you, without other people helping you understand it. And the good news is we don't have to do that, because each and every one of us is surrounded by brothers and sisters who have the mind of Christ and the Spirit of God to help us discern what God might be saying. And if they're saying something different than what you think God might be saying, it may not be that God's being unclear. It may be that you're listening to the wrong voice. Because that's the thing. We might hear something we think God is telling us, and we go tell everyone around us, our trusted advisors, and they say, I don't think that's what God's saying. And it's going to bother us because we think, yeah, but I think I'm hearing the right thing. No, maybe you're not. And that's the point. Maybe the other people around you are discerning it, and they're speaking to you. If the Apostle Paul depends on his community to help him discern even a vision like this, which to us seems so clear, if he has to have his community help him discern, why would we not do the same? I started by saying that what we want to discern is what sort of transition God is calling us to, if any. Because maybe God's call us to stay the course. Maybe God's call is to make some sort of a change. We don't want to become complacent. We don't want to rest in the place of comfort. But we also don't want to go too far the other direction, to the other pillar, and just transition simply because we think we should. What we want to do is be on the lookout for where God is calling us, so that's when it's time to transition, we make the right transition in God's timing. And he's given us 3 resources. The first is the closed doors. Closed doors are a gift from God. We don't always know why they're closed. We don't know what the purpose is, but we should not be afraid of them even when we don't know why they might be closed. The second resource is God's guidance and his leading, that God will speak to us. He will not leave you in the dark. But you may not always fully understand what God is saying. And we should not rely solely on our own instinct, and that's why we have the third resource, which is the community of people around us. Brothers and sisters who help us process what God might be saying. That is how we can discern God's call in our lives. Whether we're going into transition, we're in the midst of it, or we're coming out of it. God has not left us without answers. He has not left us without guidance. And that is the message of the gospel. Father, thank you that we can have this confidence that no matter what situation in life we're in, whether we are in one and moving out of it, whether we're in transition, moving into another one, Lord, you have given us resources to know and to be able to discern the path that you have for us. It might not happen in our timing, Lord. It might not happen when we want it to, Lord. Sometimes we might think we're hearing one thing and actually be maybe misguided, and we need brothers and sisters to correct us. But Father, I pray that you would be with us, help us to hear you, to be okay with the doors that are closed, to listen to your guidance, to follow you, to live in community so that we can have clarity. Be with us, Lord, in your name. Amen.